Hey folks, Kevin here. Well, it's April 1st, 2021, and today I thought I'd try and tackle a subject matter that's very important to all of us as gardeners and farmers and all, and that was raised in a question after I posted my video on tarps. And so I'll read you the comment and question. So it's on the UV resistant silage tarps video that I posted. JB wrote, "Hi Kevin, thanks for all that you do for our community. We are in Southwest Oregon. I'm covering a large section, 120 by 40, I think probably feet, could be meters, of organically managed, never tilled grasses to establish a perennial, multi-varietal asparagus market garden in the late fall. Super soft soil, plenty of water. We'll also cover beds with cardboard and hay or straw when planting the crowns. I am trying to determine the best way to kill off the grasses after late spring grasses cut down, leaving mulch behind for summer heat to cook under something. What are your thoughts between silage tarps, landscape fabric, plastic tarps? Any other suggestions? Thanks." So how do I go about answering this? I woke up at 1 o'clock in the morning and this question came to me, and of course it wasn't until 4 o'clock that I fell back to sleep, and then we had to get up at 5, but I woke up at 4:30, and so the two of us got up at that time. So I actually spent 3 hours thinking about this topic because it's such an important topic, and I'm always running into new challenges when it comes to weed management or weed control. So what is I'm not directly answering the question just yet. So what is a weed? A weed is a plant that is in a location that we don't want there for some reason. It's not beneficial, or we consider it to be a nuisance, or it has thorns, whatever it may be. So it's a plant in a location that could be dangerous, could be harmful, whatever. We don't want it there. It creates too much work for us. The other thing that a weed is in permaculture we use the term dynamic accumulators. And the category of plant that I think of being the best dynamic accumulators are the various weeds. And so many weeds provide a rich carbon source, higher nitrogen levels, higher carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, calcium, and magnesium, sometimes 3 times as much as any of our annual plants will. And since these plants aren't being utilized, they can break down and build soil. And like today or yesterday, 2 days ago rather, I went to a location on our property that was a homestead at one time, and probably over 300 years ago, and they dug their own well, and the soil conditions had started creeping up, so the well was actually in an indented location, even though it was on a mound, and the soil all around it was growing up like crazy. And I had noticed probably since around 1975 that there was a group of knotweeds growing in that area. These are like bamboo-like weeds that grow from a rhizome, a crown that's just below the surface of the soil. They can have roots that go down 7 feet. They can have 30 feet long lateral roots, and I'll talk a little bit more about the rhizomes and the roots in a moment. But these are considered noxious. It's considered a problematic weed, but they are indeed a dynamic accumulator. They really build big, beautiful, rich soil. So this property was farmed a couple hundred years ago, and it was just left as barren gravel basically, and of course the weeds and the grasses came up at that point. And of course there were maple trees and oak trees and ash trees and a whole variety of different a forest created. Then we had the emerald ash borer that created a lot of the problems that we have around here. But as a result of these types of weeds, the soil is built up so well in that area that it's amazing. Now knotweeds actually like a little bit more moist area, and of course that's where the well was dug. So the people who really knew what they were doing where they were selecting the sites. And I also mentioned that this is all heavy gravel, real bony rocks. Well, they picked a spot that was probably mostly sand. They built their foundation from the rocks around there. It's all broken down over time, and there's glass bottles from kids coming down here with their guns and blowing ceramic and glass and breaking things up, shooting old metal things. And so what I had to do was I had to come down here, uncover the well, because the part of the car that was covering the well was completely broken down, and I was afraid a person or an animal would break through there. So I brought Bumblebee down there, the mini excavator, and I started pulling back the soil. And then I remembered, oh yeah, this is the place where all that knotweed is. So once that gets the foliage in it, you know, this stuff can get 12, 13 feet tall, and it'd be like a dense jungle. A deer can get through it, a rabbit can get through it, but a person would have a real hard time getting through it without a machete. And all of that material, season after season, breaks down, and it just builds beautiful soil. So I'm using that soil over in some of my perennial hardwood cuttings, the gooseberry beds and all. And I'll share a video about that. So I went over, piled it all up with the mini excavator, and then I went over with Optimus Prime, the front end loader, and got some buckets and used some of the soil. That's a big potential problem. I did find a couple of the rhizomes there in that section, and I had to try and separate those out. Did I get them all out? Probably not. But I'm going to have to manage that. Now that's my aside story to talk about weeds. Are really, we look at it as a plant that we can't really utilize, or we don't realize that it's beneficial, and it's in a location that we don't want it. And when JB mentioned the grasses down there, it probably isn't a monoculture of grasses. Nature doesn't do things in monocultures. So when I look at a grass field, and we've had horses for years, so we had beautiful fields. There were all different weeds. We go in and brush hog down, but lots of beautiful grasses in there. What I always recommend doing is doing a plant assessment and create a census of what is there. Ideally going 3 times a year and looking and seeing, geez, are there broadleaf plants there? Do we have plants like asters? Do we have dock there? What is it? Because hay fields are often very, very diverse fields that are there, and the plant species that are there. So having a plant census can tell you about what sort of potential problems you can be having. So when I think about what are the potential problems, well, we can break our plant groups down into 3 different categories. First, we have the annuals versus the perennials. So the annuals are the plants that are only going to live one season, but they usually produce very tiny seeds that are quite easily wind-blown, or the birds may take them and deposit them along in the way as well. And it may not be from the actual field that you want to plant in, but it may be a neighbor's property. It may be any place. You know, if you've been around greenhouses enough, you'll see that in this part of the country, unless there's screens on the greenhouse, you're going to see weeds getting blown into the greenhouse. And so it's not completely under control. So there's those annuals that we want to identify, and those are ones by simple occultation, using a silage tarp, or using weed mats, or solarization using clear plastic. And I'll try to talk all about each one of these in a few moments as I get through this. So we have the annuals that we talked about. Then once we've identified our plants, we put it into the perennial groups, and they're one of 2 different groups of perennials. There's a stationary perennial, and then there's, I'm going to call it the walking, or the lateralizing or mobile perennials. So the stationary perennials are those ones that have a deep taproot. So a dandelion. So a dandelion has a nice big taproot. Now sometimes you dig up the dandelions, so there'll be 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. And if you don't get all the root, that's going to snap off and make 4 or 5 different plants from it. But they usually have a pretty deep taproot. The other thing about a dandelion is they have this beautiful adaptive mechanism for distributing their seeds, like thistle as well. So dandelion, dock, mullein, many of these plants that have a single long taproot, in permaculture we call them dynamic accumulators. So they can absorb and take into their structure various different elements from the bedrock and the materials there, without having had established a tremendous network of the microbial community that we would put into our permaculture beds or our food forest and all. But there are different nematodes and microarthropods working with them and protozoa, but not as diverse as the ones that we're going to be putting into our food forest or into our permanent raised beds. So these dynamic accumulators, or these single taproot, these stationary perennial plants, that root structure, and I'm going to combine here and say whether we're talking about a rhizome or a tuber or the roots, they're all energy storage units. So they can have the whole tops die off and during the winter months, or get mowed off, and they can come back again because there's enough reserves in that root structure. Then we have the walking or mobile or lateralizing perennial plants, and that's like your bindweed, certainly the knotweed, pokeweed can do that as well. Quackgrass, some of your really noxious pain in the butt plants. So I've made a video in the past about quackgrass, another one about bindweed, and how long these can go, and how big in diameter some of these bindweed roots can be. And by rototilling them and all, you may be just distributing them into different locations, or chopping them up, or cutting them out and trying to pull the plant. You may be breaking them off and leaving some of it. Now, if you've got really soft, easy, manageable soil, then that's entirely possible. But if you're putting in a plant like asparagus or different fruit and nut trees, you want to be really careful about redisturbing that crown that goes in the ground, or the roots that come from that ground for a fruit or nut tree. So those are things to think about. In your annual garden beds, it's okay. Or when you're propagating permaculture fruit bushes and so on. Those are all okay to disturb the soil in those cases. So we always have to be thinking about, when we're looking at it, am I going to be redisturbing the soil? How often will I be disturbing the soil? What our census says? Do we have, how many broadleaf plants do we have? How many annual plants do we have? How many of the stationary perennials? How many of the walking or lateralizing perennials that we have? All of those things need to be taken into account at the same time. And certainly looking at our soil, as JB has done, and moisture as well, talking about using cardboard and sheet mulching, and mulching on top of the cardboard as well. Those are things that we do here. It's a really great way of building beautiful soil. I'm always careful when we're doing sheet mulching around plants that are purposely going to die back as a perennial plant, and that are somewhat marginalizing, like asparagus can be. So they can send up new shoots and become wider and wider as the crown expands. As long as the mulching or the sheet mulching isn't inhibiting those crowns from making their way up. That's something to think about, but that's something to do. So I think I covered the importance of a census, knowing what's there, knowing what your goals and aspirations are for the beds that you want to go in, talking about some of the benefits of the weeds, because they really are, they can have 3 times the potential of absorption of all of these: calcium, magnesium, certainly carbon, nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium. All of those things are really, really beneficial, as well as other less significant, as far as we think about them, minerals as well, elements. So then we talk about what are the ways of dealing with it. Well, I really do like using silage tarps to perform one function. And well, the silage tarps, the weed mats, and the solarization, which I'll go over all three of those in a moment, help to do one very, very important thing. So if it's an annual plant that's there, they don't have energy resources in the roots. Or if it's a seed that has just germinated, it's used up all of its resources in that seed itself to get it to come to a leafy structure that can start to harvest the solar energy and the carbon dioxide and the water and start putting energy down into the root systems. So using a tarp, using weed mats, or using clear plastic for solarization can deplete recently emerged weed seeds. It can kill off annual plants as well. All three of those means can do the same thing. Now there's pulling and digging out, and that's what I've done with some bindweed and quack grasses, those sorts of things, pokeweed, and I'll be doing that with the knotweed as well. And I know I'm mentioning a lot of different weeds, but I do want the soil from those areas. So using occultation, which is using like a black UV resistant tarp and laying it over a field, that decreases light resources to the beds. But if there are any of the perennial plants, as long as there's storage, plentiful storage in the root systems, they can go through the whole winter, they can go through a whole summer, and you can plant into them in the fall or in the following spring, and then they'll send up their new growth. Because we haven't depleted the energy resources in either the taproot or those lateralizing roots or the rhizome. Either those taproots or lateralizing roots or the rhizome need to be removed mechanically, or they have to be repeated attempts. Now, when I say repeated attempts, like one example would be if every time that a plant got to be, let's say 4 inches, and I'm just using that, but let's say 4 sets of leaves coming up and it was cut off with a mower, that would deplete the resources gradually from the roots, because they really, until they get the 3rd or 4th leaf coming up from the rhizome or the root, they're utilizing all of the energy from the root structure, the stored energy, and putting it into growing the leaves. And then you cut the leaves off, then they have to repeat the mechanism again. Now, you can use flame weeding to do this as well. So flame weeding is, like, I made a video on our flame weeder, and I'll go ahead and I'm not talking about burning the plant. I'm talking about damaging the cell wall enough so that photosynthesis no longer occurs, and it takes a few days for it to go from a green leafy structure to a wilted yellow structure, and then the rhizome or root has to generate new leaves. So that can use a lot of fuels. So I use propane for our flame weeder. A mower, you're using a lot of fuel, mowing it frequently to to try and deplete the resources. So that's what I guess I'm saying. We're depleting the resources within the roots, the rhizomes, or the lateralizing roots, whether it's a taproot or not. We need to keep up the process. So there are some ways that I think this can be done. So some grasses, if it's a nice dry time of the year, you take clear plastic, like 6 mil plastic from doing construction you pick up at a box store or a contractor's store, and you lay that out and get it down so it's real good. And one good bright sunny day when the ground isn't really moist, it'll burn the tops of those. Then what you do is you remove that clear plastic and let the grasses or the weeds come back up again, and maybe even water it some if you wanted to. You could water the area if it's a nice hot dry summer. That would encourage the root structures to send up new, and this is grasses and all the other types of weeds that I've talked about, because they've got the energy resources. At that point there, you could put the solar cover over it again, and you can watch and see the grasses turn, yellowish in a sense, and they start to get burnt. Then you uncover it and you water it again. So what you're doing is you're speeding up the process of this solarization and depleting, rapidly depleting. As soon as the plants start to emerge again, you hit them again. So what you're doing is you're taking away the storage energy that's being held within this below the soil surface, and gradually taking away their resilience, their ability to come back after an event. I hope that helps. With the black silage tarps, if I wasn't in a rush, I'd lay the black silage tarps down and leave them there for a year, because every time that those plants would start to emerge. Now, if you had pokeweed, if you had, and these are things with really big root structures, pokeweed, knotweed, those ones, they might still come back the next year. So using solarization and then occultation with the silage tarp may be good as well. The other possibility is if you've knocked down 90% of them and you see these occasional ones like the pokeweed or what coming up, you can go over and dig that one out, or you can use a small independent flame weeder and just burn the top of that, you know, like once a week, going out and doing that, or using a weed whacker to do it. Along fence lines, like we've experimented with various fence lines. We're a Premier 1 fence lines, and we've done all different wire fencing as well. And if you've got a place that's pretty under control, right where that fence line is, you're going to want to control the weeds that are growing on the fence line, because if they're a seed distributor, that's going to be an issue. If it's quackgrass going there, they're going to lateralize and work into your beds as well. I do like the idea of sheet mulching. I think that's a powerful means. If you've got beautiful soil, first thing I'd say is go and do a census, see just what you have there, categorize them as well. I think I covered everything that I wanted to cover. So if you have any comments or questions, please leave them below. I hope you found this video of value. If you did, give us a thumbs up, share it with your friends. That always helps to get the channel a little bit more distributed out there, so other people can potentially benefit from some of these videos. And I think that about wraps it up. Thanks so much for watching, folks, and have a super fantastic day. And thanks, JB, for the question. Bye-bye now.